My name is Thaddeus Whisper Bennett. I'm a sound engineer who survived the first month of the zombie apocalypse by hearing them before anyone else could. While civilization crumbled, my isolated mountain station became both prison and sanctuary. Now supplies are running low, and the dead are learning to evolve. This is how I lived when millions died. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Thaddeus Bennett. Most people who know me, the few who are still alive, that is, call me Whisper. It's not the name my parents gave me, but it's the one that kept me breathing when the dead started walking. I was a sound engineer for NOAA, stationed at a remote monitoring facility in the Cascade Mountains. My job was to record and analyze environmental sounds, everything from rainfall patterns to animal migrations to the subtle acoustic changes that might indicate shifts in our climate. I spent 5 years in that station before the outbreak, perched on the mountainside with a clear view of Seattle in the distance. My equipment wasn't standard issue. I'd modified most of it myself, expanded the frequency range, boosted the sensitivity, created software to identify and categorize sounds that most people would never even notice. My centerpiece was what I called the dish, a parabolic microphone array that could pick up a squirrel's heartbeat from half a mile away. Excessive for most people, essential for my work, life-saving when the world ended. My background probably helped too. My father was African American, a physics professor specializing in acoustics. My mother was Salish, taught me how to move through forests without snapping a single twig. Both gone now, I imagine, like almost everyone else. The day everything changed wasn't dramatic at first. Tuesday, October 12, 2023. I remember because I was updating my weather logs when the emergency broadcast cut through my radio signals. The voice was calm, professional, just another disease outbreak in Seattle, they said. Stay indoors if possible. Avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. Standard protocol. I'd heard similar warnings for COVID variants over the years. I called headquarters immediately. Maria, my research coordinator, sounded stressed but not panicked. Some new flu strain, she told me. They're shutting down some public transportation as a precaution. Probably nothing. I went back to work. That morning I'd been tracking the unusual silence from the bird populations to the south. They'd gone quiet 3 days earlier, migrating patterns, shifting weeks ahead of schedule. I should have recognized it as the warning it was. Animals always know first when something's wrong. By evening, the emergency broadcasts were more frequent. The disease was spreading faster than anticipated. Hospitals were at capacity. The National Guard was being deployed to maintain order. I took my binoculars to the observation deck and looked toward Seattle. Even from 30 miles away, I could see the unusual traffic patterns, the helicopter lights circling downtown, the distinct absence of commercial air traffic. I called my sister, Leah. She worked as a nurse at Harbor Medical Center. She didn't answer. I left a message suggesting she take the kids and leave the city just in case. Just in case. Such innocent words for what was coming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept my headphones on, scanning through frequencies, recording everything. The emergency channels were chaos by midnight. Reports of violent attacks in multiple hospitals. Patients with high fevers becoming aggressive, biting medical staff. The word containment repeated with increasing urgency. I sat there in the dark, listening to the world change frequency by frequency, channel by channel. By dawn, half the channels had gone silent. The remaining broadcasts had abandoned their measured tones. National Guard units were being overwhelmed. The disease, they were calling it the NATO syndrome now, progressed from fever to aggression to something they couldn't quite describe. Patients appeared deceased but remained mobile and hostile. One doctor reported before his channel went dead. I watched Seattle through my binoculars as the sun rose. Black smoke billowed from at least 6 locations downtown. The roads leaving the city were packed bumper to bumper. I tried calling Leah again. Nothing. Headquarters. Nothing. The landlines were down. Cell networks overwhelmed. I turned to my equipment, to the one thing I understood. I aimed the dish toward the city and put on my headphones. What I heard changed everything I thought I knew. Cities have soundscapes, distinctive acoustic signatures as unique as fingerprints. I'd studied Seattle's for years. The constant low rumble of traffic. The staccato rhythm of construction. The harmonics of human conversation blending into white noise at a distance. But what I heard that morning was wrong. The traffic sounds were chaotic, punctuated by crashes and screams. And underneath it all, something new. A sound I'd never recorded before. A low, continuous moan. Not quite human, not quite animal. Thousands of voices merged into a discordant chorus that made my skin crawl. I adjusted my equipment, isolated the frequency, analyzed its pattern. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't behaving like any crowd I'd ever studied. For 3 days, I watched and listened as Seattle died. The power grid failed in sections, first downtown, then the residential areas, finally the industrial zones. The emergency broadcasts became fewer and fewer, each one more desperate than the last. The final official transmission I received was from a military unit requesting immediate evacuation. Their position was being overrun. They described the attackers as non-responsive to pain or verbal commands, continuing assault despite catastrophic injuries. The transmission cut mid-sentence. By the 4th day, what had been a distant tragedy became a personal survival situation. My station had enough supplies for 2 months if I rationed carefully. The solar panels and backup generator could maintain power indefinitely. I had a rifle and ammunition for hunting. Most importantly, I had isolation and early warning capabilities that no one else had. I began systematically monitoring the areas around my station. The dish could pick up sounds from miles away. I started mapping the movements of both the infected and any potential survivors. The patterns became clear quickly. The infected were drawn to sound, any sound. They would move toward noise with single-minded purpose. The first time I witnessed this was through my observation equipment. A helicopter, probably military or rescue, flew over a rural area about 10 miles from my position. The noise of its engines triggered movement below. From my vantage point, I could see dozens, then hundreds of figures emerging from buildings, woods everywhere, all moving toward the sound. When the helicopter landed briefly, they swarmed it. It never took off again. I realized then what I had that others didn't: the ability to hear them coming long before they arrived. My equipment could detect the distinctive moaning from miles away. I could track their movements, their numbers, their patterns. In a world where making the wrong noise meant death, I had the ultimate advantage. For 2 weeks, I remained alone at my station. I created acoustic maps of the surrounding areas, marking hot zones where infected congregated and quiet corridors where movement might be possible. I experimented with my equipment, learning to distinguish between infected sounds and the noises of surviving animals or potential human survivors. I set up automated monitoring systems that would alert me to approaching threats from any direction. Then came the hiker. I detected him before I saw him, labored breathing, uneven footsteps climbing the access road to my station. Human movements, not the shuffling gait of the infected. I watched through binoculars as he stumbled up the path, clearly exhausted. A man in his 30s, carrying a backpack, clothes torn and dirty. The first living human I'd seen in 15 days. I should have been more cautious, but isolation does things to your mind. I needed human contact, information, confirmation that the world hadn't completely ended. I met him at the perimeter fence, rifle in hand but not raised. "Water," was the first thing he said. "Please." His name was Daniel. He'd been part of a camping group in the national forest when the outbreak hit. They'd received warning calls from family, decided to stay in the wilderness rather than return to the cities. Smart move. But supplies ran low and arguments broke out. The group split up. Daniel had been heading toward the ranger station when he spotted my facility on the ridgeline. I gave him water, food, medical supplies for his blistered feet. He looked feverish, but insisted it was just exhaustion and dehydration. I wanted to believe him. I let him sleep in the storage room while I kept watch. That night, I was reviewing sound data when my proximity alerts triggered. Something was moving outside the perimeter. I checked the monitors, nothing visible in the moonlight. I put on my headphones and aimed the dish toward the disturbance. What I heard chilled my blood. The distinctive moan of the infected, but just one voice. Close. Too close. I grabbed my rifle and checked the storage room. Daniel was gone. I found him outside, moving jerkily around the perimeter fence. His movements were wrong, spasmodic, uncoordinated. When he turned toward the sound of my approach, his eyes were bloodshot, vacant, his mouth unopened, emitting that same moan I'd been recording for weeks. He didn't a bite wound. Must have gotten it before reaching my station. The infection had finally overtaken him. The thing that had been Daniel lurched toward me faster than I expected. I raised my rifle but hesitated. This had been a person hours earlier, someone with a story, a past, hopes of survival. The hesitation nearly killed me. He crossed the distance with unnatural speed, clawed hands reaching for me. I stumbled backward, fell. The rifle clattered away. In desperation, I grabbed the only weapon at hand, my grandfather's hunting knife, always in my boot. The fight was brief, brutal. His strength was incredible and human, but his movements were predictable, driven by pure instinct. When it was over, I was covered in blood that didn't look quite right. Too dark, too thick. The knife remained buried in his temple. It took me 3 hours to drag the body far from the station and bury it deep. Not out of respect, but necessity. I'd learned 2 critical lessons. The infection spread through bites, and I couldn't trust anyone, no matter how human they appeared. After that night, I reinforced my security measures. I expanded my acoustic monitoring, setting up additional stations at strategic points around the perimeter. I began experimenting with sounds that might attract or repel the infected. Most importantly, I started recording and analyzing the sounds of the infected themselves, creating a detailed acoustic profile. The infected weren't just mindless. They responded to stimuli in predictable ways. Certain frequencies agitated them, others seemed to confuse them. I could use sound not just for early detection, but potentially as a weapon or shield. For a week after Daniel, I didn't detect any human survivors in my monitoring range. The infected, however, were changing their patterns. They were congregating in larger groups, moving together like schools of fish or flocks of birds. Sometimes they would stand completely still for hours, then suddenly move in unison toward a sound that I could barely detect with my equipment. By day 23 since the first broadcast, I faced an inevitable truth. Despite my security, despite my early warning systems, I couldn't stay at the station indefinitely. My supplies were running low. Without proper nutrition, I'd weaken. Without medicine, any minor injury could become fatal. I needed to venture into the valley, into what had once been civilization. I spent 3 days preparing for my descent into the valley. Every decision could mean life or death, so I approached it with the same methodical precision I'd used in my research. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was facing. I compiled all my acoustic data into what I called a progression timeline, the way the infected sounds had changed over the past 3 weeks. In the beginning, they made more human noises, screams, shouts, even words occasionally. But as days passed, their vocalizations simplified into that distinctive moaning. The pitch and rhythm varied slightly between individuals, but the basic sound was consistent, a continuous tone that rose and fell like a broken siren. What disturbed me most was the response to each other. When one began moaning at a higher intensity, others nearby would join in, creating a cascading effect. It reminded me of wolves howling or whales calling to each other across vast distances. Communication, but at its most primitive level. I packed carefully, taking only what was essential. My modified headphones with directional microphones, a small tablet loaded with acoustic analysis software, basic survival gear. My grandfather's knife, clean now, but I still saw Daniel's blood on it every time I closed my eyes. And my most important creation, what I called acoustic lures, small devices that could emit specific sounds to draw the infected away from my path. The morning of my departure was clear and cold. Late autumn in the Cascades meant snow would arrive any day. Another reason I couldn't delay. I locked down most of the station's systems, setting them to run automated monitoring programs. If I made it back, the data would be waiting. If not, at least I'd have contributed something to understanding what we were facing. The first part of my journey was familiar. The access road leading down from my station. I'd hiked it hundreds of times before. But now, every step felt like moving further from safety and deeper into hostile territory. I kept my headphones on, constantly scanning for the telltale moans. 3 miles down, I picked up my first signals. A small group, perhaps 5 or 6 infected, moving through the forest about a mile east of my position. I froze, adjusting my equipment to track their movement. They weren't heading toward me, but parallel to my path. I waited, barely breathing, until they passed beyond my detection range. By midday, I reached the highway that connected the mountain communities to Seattle. What I saw confirmed everything the radio broadcasts had described. Cars abandoned in both directions, some crashed into each other, others simply stopped, with doors hanging open. Personal belongings scattered across the asphalt, suitcases, toys, electronics. The physical evidence of panic. And blood. So much blood. Smeared across windows, pooled on seats, sprayed across the road in patterns that told stories I didn't want to read. I stayed off the highway, moving parallel to it through the trees. The vehicles would provide useful supplies, but also made too much open ground to cross. I needed cover, shadows, places to hide if my early warning system detected movement. The first town I encountered was little more than a crossroads with a gas station, diner, and small cluster of houses. Mountain Vista. Population 347, according to the weathered sign. From my vantage point in the tree line, I could see figures moving between buildings. Their jerky, uncoordinated gait marked them clearly as infected. I put on my headphones and aimed my directional microphone toward the town. At least 20 distinct moaning patterns, too many to risk entering directly. I would need to circle around. As I adjusted my position, a new sound caught my attention. Not the moan of the infected, but a sharp mechanical noise, rhythmic, deliberate, human. Someone was hammering something in one of the houses at the edge of town. The sound stopped, then started again. From my position, I could see infected heads turning toward the noise, bodies beginning to move in that direction. Whoever was making that sound had minutes, maybe seconds before they were surrounded. I faced a choice: continue on my planned route, preserving my safety and supplies, or attempt to warn another survivor, risking everything. I wish I could tell you I immediately rushed to help. That would make for a better story, wouldn't it? The truth is I hesitated. In this new world, other humans were as likely to be threats as allies. Daniel had taught me that, and whoever was hammering clearly didn't understand the most basic rule of survival: silence. But then I thought about my sister Leah, about her kids. Were they hiding somewhere, making some innocent noise that was drawing death to their door? Would I want someone to warn them? I set up one of my acoustic lures, programming it to activate in 2 minutes with a sound that would draw the infected away from both me and the hammering. Then I circled toward the house, moving as quietly as my mother had taught me years ago. The hammering continued, punctuated by what sounded like frustrated muttering, a man's voice. As I approached the back of the house, I could see through a window that he was attempting to board up a broken door. The wooden boards kept splitting when he nailed them, hence the repeated attempts. My lure activated with a sound like breaking glass about a quarter-mile away. The infected in the street immediately turned and shambled toward it. The man inside, focused on his task, noticed nothing. I tapped softly on the back window. He spun, raising his hammer defensively. Young, maybe early 20s, with a patchy beard and wild eyes. Fear incarnate. "They hear you?" I whispered, pointing toward the front of the house. "The hammering. They're coming." His eyes widened. He looked toward the front window, then back at me. "Who are you?" he mouthed. "Someone who doesn't want to see you die. Grab what you need. 30 seconds. Back door." I moved to the door he'd been trying to secure. The wood around the lock was splintered. Someone had broken in before him. I drew my knife and waited. He appeared moments later with a backpack and the hammer. Still looking suspicious, but with fewer options by the second. My lure would only distract the infected for a few minutes. "Follow me," I whispered. "Step exactly where I step. Make no sound." We made it to the tree line, just as the first infected began wandering back from the false alarm of my lure. The young man was breathing heavily, clearly unused to moving quietly or quickly. I signaled for him to follow me deeper into the forest before we could safely talk. A mile away, with no signs of pursuit, I finally turned to face him. "Who are you?" He asked again, this time at normal volume. "Still too loud." "Lower your voice," I instructed. "Sound travels. I'm Thaddeus. Most people call me Whisper." "I'm Eric," he replied, more quietly this time. "Were those really, are they actually, zombies?" I finished for him. "Not exactly. They're infected with something that kills them, then reanimates their bodies with the most basic functions. They can't reason or communicate beyond making noise. But they can hear. Better than before, it seems." "How do you know all this?" I tapped my modified headphones. "I'm a sound engineer. I've been studying them for my research station in the mountains. They hunt by sound. The hammering you were doing might as well have been a dinner bell." Eric looked down at his hammer, seemingly processing this information. "I was trying to make it safe for the night. My car broke down 3 days ago. I've been moving from house to house, trying to find a working vehicle." "Where are you trying to go?" "North. I heard there's a safe zone in Canada. Military protection, supplies, medical care." I'd heard no such broadcasts, but radio transmissions had been spotty at best. It was possible that northern areas, with lower population density, had established some kind of containment. "Have you seen any evidence of organized response, military, government?" I asked. Eric shook his head. "Nothing. Just those things. And a few people running, like me. No one stays together long. Trust issues, you know." I did know. Trust could get you killed just as quickly as noise, but isolation had its own dangers. "I'm heading to Riverside," I told him. "Larger town about 10 miles west. Looking for supplies to bring back to my station. You're welcome to come along, but we move quietly, and you follow my lead exactly. I've got equipment that can hear them before they hear us." Eric agreed immediately. Looking back, I think he would have followed anyone who seemed to have a plan. Fear does that to people, makes them surrender autonomy for the illusion of safety. We traveled until dusk, moving carefully through the forest parallel to the highway. I detected several groups of infected along the way, but we were able to avoid them by adjusting our route. Eric wasn't naturally quiet, but he was a quick learner. By the time we made camp, he was moving with a fraction of his earlier noise. We didn't risk a fire. The night was cold, but the light and smoke would have been beacons to both infected and desperate survivors. Instead, we found shelter in a small hunting cabin, checking it thoroughly before settling in. "So what were you before all this?" Eric asked as we ate cold rations from my pack. "Some kind of specialized military guy." I almost laughed, not even close. "I told you I was a sound engineer for NOAA. Weather and environmental monitoring. I was tracking climate change through acoustic signatures when everything fell apart." Sound can tell you about climate change. Sound can tell you almost anything if you know how to listen, I explained. Animal populations, vegetation density, geological activity. Every environment has its own unique soundscape, and changes in that soundscape can indicate larger systemic shifts. And now you're using it to avoid zombies. Talk about transferable skills. This time I did laugh, just a small one. The first in what felt like years. Not the career path I anticipated, no. Eric was quiet for a moment. I was a nursing student, third year. I was at the hospital when the first cases came in. We thought it was some kind of rabies variant at first. Patients with high fevers, extreme aggression, hypersensitivity to stimuli. Then they started dying, but they didn't stay dead. I'd suspected as much from the broadcasts, but hearing it confirmed firsthand was different. How fast did it spread? Hours, maybe minutes for some people. Light to fever to aggression to death to whatever they are now. The hospital was overrun before we even understood what was happening. I ran, left my patients, my colleagues, everyone. Just ran. His voice broke on the last word. "You survived," I said simply. "That's what matters now." Is it though? What's the point of surviving in a world like this? I had no easy answer. I'd asked myself the same question countless times over the past weeks. Understanding, I finally replied. Someone needs to survive to understand what happened, to learn from it. Maybe find a way to stop it. The next morning, we continued toward Riverside. The journey was slower with 2 people, but having another set of eyes and ears provided its own advantages. We reached the outskirts of the town by midday, taking position on a wooded hillside overlooking the main street. Riverside was larger than Mountain Vista, a proper town with several thousand residents before the outbreak. Now it was a maze of abandoned vehicles, scattered belongings, and wandering infected. I counted at least 50 from our vantage point, but suspected many more were inside buildings or hidden by structures. I put on my headphones and began methodically scanning the town, creating an acoustic map of infected concentrations. The downtown area is heavily populated, I told Eric, but the eastern residential section seems clearer. We should be able to approach through the creek bed, staying low and quiet. "What are we looking for exactly?" Eric asked. "Medications, primarily. Antibiotics, painkillers, first aid supplies. Then non-perishable food, batteries, anything useful that's compact enough to carry back to the station. The pharmacy on Oak Street would be ideal, if we can reach it." "There's a larger pharmacy in the supermarket on the north side," Eric suggested. "Might have more stock." I adjusted my equipment, scanning in that direction. Too many of them clustered there. The noise from the refrigeration systems failing probably attracted them. The smaller pharmacy is our best bet. We made our approach through the creek bed as planned, moving from cover to cover. The water, though only ankle deep, helped mask our scent, another factor I'd observed affecting the infected's awareness. They seemed to rely primarily on hearing, but smell appeared to play a role as well. We were 100 yards from the pharmacy when my equipment picked up a new sound. Not the moan of the infected, but a subtle rhythmic thumping. Mechanical, like a generator. "Someone's got power," I whispered to Eric. "Where?" I adjusted my directional microphone, triangulating the source. 2 blocks north, 2nd floor. Apartment building, I think. Should we check it out? I considered our options. The pharmacy was our primary objective, but connecting with other survivors could provide valuable information, possibly additional resources. And whoever had maintained a power source this long likely had useful skills. Pharmacy first, I decided. Then we'll investigate the power source if the path remains clear. We reached the pharmacy without incident, slipping in through a broken window in the back. The interior was dark, shelves partially empty but not completely looted. Eric moved with purpose, his nursing training evident as he quickly identified and gathered the most valuable medications. I kept watch, headphones on, monitoring the sounds outside. The infected moved in irregular patterns, but there was a strange synchronicity to their movements. When one changed direction, others nearby often followed. Not coordination exactly, but a kind of primitive herd behavior. We filled our bags quickly, focusing on antibiotics, analgesics, and wound care supplies. Eric also grabbed pregnancy tests and prenatal vitamins, things I wouldn't have thought of but made perfect sense for long-term survival planning. As we prepared to exit, a new sound caught my attention. A door opening and closing not far away. Then footsteps, human footsteps, purposeful and direct, moving toward the pharmacy. I signaled to Eric to freeze, adjusting my equipment to track the approach. Single individual, moving cautiously but not silently. Armed, based on the subtle metallic sounds accompanying their movement, coming from the direction of the building with power. We had seconds to decide, attempt to hide, prepare to confront, or try to escape before they arrived. The approaching footsteps paused, then changed direction slightly. They'd noticed something. The broken window perhaps, or some sign of our presence. I positioned myself beside the doorway, knife ready. Eric took cover behind the pharmacy counter, clutching his newly acquired medical supplies. The footsteps approached, deliberate and cautious. Through my headphones, I could hear the controlled breathing of someone trained to move with purpose. The door pushed open slowly. First, the barrel of a rifle appeared, then hands, gloved steady. Finally, a face. A woman, early 40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the watchful eyes of a predator. Military based on her methodical room-clearing technique and the remnants of a uniform under her civilian coat. She spotted me immediately but didn't fire. Instead, she assessed, eyes flickering from my position to Eric's, then to our bags of supplies. "Those are community resources you're taking," she said, voice slow but caring. Not quite a whisper, but practiced enough to avoid attracting the infected. "We didn't know there was a community," I replied, keeping my knife visible but not threatening. "We thought the town was abandoned except for the infected." She studied my modified headphones, the directional microphone. "What's with the gear?" "I'm a sound engineer. I use it to detect and avoid the infected. They hunt primarily by sound." Something in her posture shifted slightly, interest, perhaps recognition of useful information. "You've been studying them?" "From my research station in the mountains. For almost a month now." She lowered her rifle fractionally. "And you're what, on a supply run?" "Medications mainly. Our supplies are running low." I gestured toward Eric. Found him trying to hammer boards over a broken door. Saved him before the noise attracted every infected in the area. The woman's eyes narrowed at Eric. "You're making noise out there. That kind of stupidity gets people killed." Eric flushed. "I didn't know they were so sensitive to sound." "There's a lot I don't know," she replied, then turned back to me. "I'm Lieutenant Andrea Fisher, formerly 4th Infantry. Currently trying to keep 23 civilians alive in an apartment building 2 blocks north. We've had a generator, some supplies, and basic defenses. But medications are running low. I made a quick decision. I'm Thaddeus Bennett. They call me Whisper. This is Eric. We'll share what we've gathered if you're willing to share information and possibly shelter for the night. I'm making acoustic maps of infected movements through the region." Lieutenant Fisher considered this, then nodded once. "Their trade, but we move now. Those things have patterns, and they'll be sweeping the street in about 20 minutes. "How do you know their patterns?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Observation from the roof, and watching them for 2 weeks. They're not random, not entirely." She gestured for us to follow. "Stay close, stay quiet. Single file, 5-foot spacing. I lead, you follow." We exited through the back of the pharmacy, Fisher leading us through a series of narrow alleys. Her route showed intimate knowledge of the town's layout and consistent awareness of sightlines and potential threats. We crossed open areas quickly but calmly, freezing in place whenever infected appeared in our path. The apartment building had been fortified discreetly. Modifications visible only when you were directly in front of them. The first-floor windows were boarded from the inside, leaving no external evidence of occupation. Entry was through a second-floor fire escape that could be raised once we were inside. Fisher led us through a series of improvised security checkpoints, survivors with makeshift weapons watching us warily as we passed. The apartment complex had been consolidated, with interior walls removed between some units to create communal spaces, while maintaining separate sleeping quarters. The heart of their operation was a former community room, now converted into a command center of sorts. Maps of the town covered one wall, with markings indicating infected concentrations, supply catches, and potential escape routes. A hand radio sat in the corner, though I noticed it wasn't currently operational. "This is our new arrival," Fisher had announced to the small group gathered around a table. Sound engineer with monitoring equipment, been studying the infected from a research station, and his companion, a nursing student. The reception was mixed, some curious, others suspicious. One man, heavyset with a firefighter's jacket, stepped forward. "What exactly do you know about these things that we don't?" "They hunt primarily by sound," I explained. "Their hearing seems enhanced compared to their pre-infection capabilities. They detect, orient toward, and pursue noise with remarkable efficiency. They'd also demonstrate rudimentary communication through their vocalizations. When one is agitated, others respond." "We knew about the sound sensitivity," Fisher said. "That's why we maintained strict noise discipline. But the communication aspect is new information." "It's not communication as we understand it," I clarified. "More like contagious behavior. One begins moaning at a higher intensity, others join in. Creates a cascade effect that can spread through large groups." "Like a horde mentality," suggested a younger woman near the back. "Exactly. They also move together more coordinated than you might expect. Not quite pack behavior, but definitely not completely independent either." Fisher nodded toward my equipment. "And those like you hear them coming. From up to a mile away under ideal conditions. I've mapped their acoustic signatures, created profiles for different group sizes, even detected subtle differences between individuals." This sparked genuine interest among the group. Fisher directed us to empty our bags on the table, displaying the medications and supplies we'd gathered. Eric explained the medical significance of each item, his nursing knowledge earning respect from several survivors. As night fell, the group's organization became more apparent. They'd operated in shifts: watch duty, meal preparation, equipment maintenance. Despite limited resources, they functioned with surprising efficiency. Fisher's military background was evident in their protocols, but this wasn't a military operation. It was something new, adaptive. Over a sparse but welcome meal of canned vegetables and dried meat, Fisher explained their situation. They'd banded together in the early days of the outbreak: neighbors, strangers, anyone who hadn't fled or returned. The apartment building was defensible, with limited access points and good visibility. The generator provided minimal power for essential functions, carefully rationed to conserve fuel. "We've been isolated since the national broadcast stopped," Fisher explained. "No contact with any government or military units. Last transmission suggested fallback to secure zones, but no coordinates were provided. For all we know, we're the last organized group in the state." "I heard something about safe zones in Canada," Eric mentioned. "Military protection supplies." Fisher shook her head. "Rumors. We heard similar about eastern Washington, Oregon border, even ship-based havens off the coast. Nothing confirmed." "What about Seattle?" I asked, thinking of my sister. "Any word on evacuation success?" "Some buses got out early," a man identified as a former transit worker replied. "Military escort, heading east mainly. But the city was overrun within 48 hours. Harbor Medical Center was one of the first to fall." My heart sank. Lee had been at Harbor when everything started, but buses got out. There was still hope. "We need to know what you've learned," Fisher said, bringing the conversation back to practical matters. "Anything that might help us survive." I spent the next hour sharing my observations: the infected's sensitivity to specific frequency ranges, their movement patterns, the successful use of sound blurs to direct them away from targets. I explained my acoustic mapping techniques, how to identify areas of high and low activity based on ambient noise levels. In return, they shared their ground-level observations. The infected seemed to be developing patterns, more active at dawn and dusk, congregating in areas that had been densely populated before the outbreak. They didn't appear to eat or drink, yet remained animated indefinitely. Physical deterioration was minimal despite injuries that would incapacitate or kill an uninfected human. "They're learning," said an elderly man who'd been introduced as Professor Kelvin, formerly of the community college. "Not consciously perhaps, but adaptively. They respond differently to repeated stimuli. The same trick doesn't work twice." This matched my own observations. Their behavior is evolving. The moaning has changed frequency over time, becoming more effective at carrying over distance. And they're more synchronized now than in the early days. "So they're getting smarter?" Eric asked, alarm evident in his voice. "Not smarter," I clarified. "More efficient. It's not conscious adaptation. More like natural selection in real time. Behaviors that work get reinforced." Which means our strategies need to evolve too, Fisher concluded. Your sound equipment and knowledge could be invaluable to us. We've been maintaining this position successfully, but resources are dwindling. Eventually, we'll need to move. Where would you go? I asked. East probably, away from population centers. Find some place defensible with access to water and potential for growing food. Winter's coming. We need to be established somewhere secure before the snow. I considered my options. A mountain station was safe, isolated but limited in supplies and unable to sustain more than a few people. These survivors had organization, diverse skills, a functional community structure. But they lacked my early warning capabilities, my understanding of the infected's acoustic vulnerabilities. I need to return to my station, I said finally. My equipment there is more comprehensive, and I've got research data that could be crucial. But I could help establish an early warning system here before I go. Train someone to recognize the acoustic signatures. Fisher studied me carefully. Or you could bring your data here, join forces. Safety in numbers, especially with your particular skills. It was tempting. Human contact after weeks of isolation. A group with structure and purpose. But my station represented something more than just personal safety. It was a repository of knowledge, a laboratory for understanding what we were facing. I need to retrieve my data at minimum, I compromised. After that, we can discuss next steps. I'll leave Eric here if he wants to stay. His medical knowledge will be more useful to you than to me alone at the station. Eric nodded agreement, seeming relieved to have found a relatively secure situation. We spent the rest of the evening setting up a basic acoustic monitoring system using parts of my equipment. I trained two of their more technically inclined members on the fundamentals of distinguishing infected sounds from background noise. As we prepared for sleep, my first night with the luxury of closing my eyes fully in weeks, Fisher approached with a folded paper. Found this in a batch of evacuation records we recovered from the town hall, she said, handing it to me. Saw your name earlier and remembered it. I unfolded the paper, a printout of evacuation bus assignments, and there it was, Leah Bennett and children, bus 17, departure 5:23 a.m., October 14th. Destination, Eastern Washington Secure Zone, Fort Simmons. She got out, I whispered, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. Maybe, Fisher cautioned. This just means she was assigned evacuation. Whether the bus actually departed, whether it reached its destination, that we don't know. Still, it was the first concrete lead I had. Fort Simmons was an old military installation near the Idaho border. If it had been established as a secure zone, if Lee had reached it, if it still stood, many ifs, but more hope than I'd had that morning. Thank you, I said simply. Fisher nodded. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you back to your station and perhaps planning a more permanent arrangement. I slept fitfully, dreams filled with bus accidents and infected passengers. When I woke before dawn, the apartment was already active, watch changing, morning routines underway. Every movement deliberate, minimal noise. These people had adapted quickly to the new reality. I joined the morning briefing, where Fisher was going over the day's priorities. Supply inventory, perimeter maintenance, water collection from recent rainfall. Normal life, redefined. Thaddeus will be returning to his research station today, she informed the group. Thomas and Lynn have been trained on basic acoustic monitoring techniques. Eric will be staying with us, adding his medical expertise to our community. There were nods of acceptance. In this new world, people came and went. Attachments formed cautiously, pragmatically. I prepared to leave, packing a small portion of the medications we'd gathered and receiving a spare radio from their limited supply. The plan was simple. I would return to my station, gather essential research data and equipment, then return to discuss potential relocation or collaboration. As I checked my gear one final time, Professor Cullen approached, his academic curiosity apparently undimmed by apocalyptic circumstances. Your work on the infected's acoustic signatures, he began, have you considered the implications of their evolutionary trajectory? In what sense? If they're adapting in real time, becoming more efficient hunters, more coordinated in their movements, where does that process lead? When do they become given enough time without intervention? It was a question I'd avoided asking myself directly. The implications were too disturbing. I've observed increasing synchronization in their movements and vocalizations, greater sensitivity to specific frequency ranges, more rapid response to stimuli. Kelvin nodded. Collective behavior emerging from individual adaptations. Fascinating and terrifying. Nature finding a way, even through this perversion of life. Nature isn't sentimental, I replied. It optimizes for survival, not humanity. Precisely why your research matters so much, he said. Understanding their evolution may be the key to outwitting it, to finding a weakness before they eliminate it through adaptation. Fisher interrupted our philosophical discussion with practical concerns. Daylight's wasting. If you're going, now's the time. Lynn will escort you to the eastern perimeter. I said my goodbyes to Eric, promised to return with my research data, and followed Lynn, a former park ranger with excellent awareness of terrain, through the building's security protocols. She led me through a series of quiet streets and alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares where infected tended to congregate. At the edge of town, where buildings gave way to scattered houses and eventually forest, she stopped. This is as far as I go. Follow the tree line north until you hit Buckley Creek, then follow it upstream. Should be your most direct route with the best cover. I thanked her, adjusted my headphones, and began the journey back to my mountain sanctuary. The forest felt different now, still dangerous, but in a known rather than unknown way. I understood the threats, had developed systems for navigating them. Knowledge was power, even in this broken world. As I walked, I scanned constantly with my directional microphone, tracking infected movements near my path. They were sparse here compared to the town, but still present. Solitary wanderers were small groups, moving with that distinctive gait that was neither fully coordinated nor completely awkward. I thought about what Professor Kelvin had said about their evolution, about what they might become with enough time. And I thought about Leah, about the possibility that she had reached safety with her children. Two paths forward, understanding the threat and finding what remained of my family. For the first time since the outbreak, I had purpose beyond mere survival. The journey back to my station was more difficult than the descent had been. Moving uphill requires more exertion, creates more sound. Every labored breath seemed deafening in the forest's unnatural silence. I had to stop frequently, monitoring for infected drawn to my passage. By mid-afternoon, I reached the access road leading to the station. From the outside, everything appeared undisturbed. Solar panels still intact on the roof, perimeter fence unbreached. But I knew better than to trust appearances. I spent 30 minutes in the surrounding forest, listening with my equipment for any signs of movement inside or around the structure. Silence, not the absence of sound. True silence doesn't exist in nature, but the absence of infected. No moaning, no shuffling footsteps, no signs of disturbance in the normal patterns of wildlife that had begun returning to the area. I approached cautiously nonetheless, entering through my security protocols. The station was exactly as I'd left it. My monitoring systems had continued recording data automatically during my absence. 3 days of acoustic information waiting to be analyzed. I set to work immediately, downloading my comprehensive research files, backing them up onto portable drives. The most important data wouldn't take physical space: acoustic signatures, behavioral analyses, movement patterns, response wavelengths. Knowledge that could keep people alive. As the downloads progressed, I reviewed the new data. What I found confirmed Professor Kelvin's concerns about evolutionary adaptation. The infected's vocalizations showed subtle but measurable shifts toward more effective frequencies, tones that carried further, penetrated barriers more successfully, and appeared to generate stronger responses from other infected. Even more concerning were the movement patterns. The recordings showed larger groups forming, moving with increased coordination. Not quite organized, but demonstrating emergent behaviors that trended toward efficiency. They were getting better at being predators. I gathered essential equipment, the specialized components I need to establish a more comprehensive early warning system for Fisher's group. The dish itself was too bulky to transport, but I could rebuild something similar with the right parts. I'd also packed my research journals, the physical records of my observations that couldn't be digitized easily. Night was falling by the time I finished. I faced a choice: begin the return journey immediately or spend one last night in the relative security of my station. The practical choice was obvious. Traveling through forest at night, even with my acoustic equipment, carried substantially higher risk. I secured the station for the night, setting up automated monitoring to alert me to any approach. Sitting at my workstation with a meager dinner of canned beans, I felt an unexpected pang of loss. This place had been my home for 5 years, my sanctuary during the collapse. Leaving it, even temporarily, felt like abandoning a part of myself. I spent the night finalizing my research notes, organizing everything for transfer to the survivor group. If my knowledge was going to help others survive, it needed to be accessible, understandable to people without my specialized background. At dawn, I made final preparations, packed essential supplies, equipment, data. left the station secured but accessible if I needed to return. As a precaution, I hid a key and access codes in a location only I would think to look, under a specific rock formation that had been part of my acoustic mapping reference points. The journey down was quicker this time. Familiarity with the route, lighter mental burden perhaps. I maintained constant acoustic monitoring, adjusting my path to avoid several infected wanderers detected in the forest. By mid-morning, I could see Riverside in the distance. Something was wrong. Even from a mile away, I could detect unusually high infected activity in and around the town. I adjusted my equipment, focusing on the apartment building where Fisher's group had established their community. The acoustic signature was chaotic, not the disciplined, quiet operation I'd left days earlier. I approached cautiously, using the cover of forest as long as possible. When I reached the final stretch of open ground before the town proper, I took position on a hillside with clear sightlines. What I saw confirmed my fears. The streets around the apartment building were filled with infected. Dozens of them, moving with purpose toward the structure. The building itself showed signs of hasty reinforcement, furniture piled against ground floor windows, makeshift barricades at entrances. But the defenses were failing. Infected were breaking through in multiple locations. I switched my directional microphone to the upper floors, searching for signs of survivors. Faint voices, movement, the sound of furniture being dragged across floors. They were still in there, still fighting. But the situation was clearly dire. The cause became apparent as I scanned further. A vehicle, an old delivery truck, was crashed into a storefront 2 blocks from the apartment. Its alarm was blaring intermittently, drawing infected from throughout the town. Someone had attempted a supply run or perhaps an evacuation and failed catastrophically. I needed to act, but a frontal approach would be suicide. The infected were too numerous, too concentrated around the building. I needed a distraction, something to draw them away from the apartments long enough for survivors to escape. Then I remembered the generator. Fisher's group had maintained power, used it sparingly. If I could reach it, modify it, I might be able to create a sound lure powerful enough to redirect the horde. I circled the town, approaching from the north where infected concentration was lowest. Moving building to building, staying low and silent, I worked my way toward the apartment. The situation deteriorated further. With each passing minute, the infected had breached the ground floor completely. Survivors were retreating upward, abandoning floors as they became indefensible. I reached a building adjacent to the apartment complex, close enough to attempt communication. Using a small mirror from my pack, I signaled one of the upper windows where I'd spotted movement. After several attempts, someone noticed. A face appeared briefly, then vanished. Minutes later, the emergency exit door on the building's east side opened fractionally. A voice whispered, "Identify yourself." "Whisper," I replied. "The sound engineer. What happened?" The door opened wider, revealing Eric, the nursing student I'd left with the group. His face was streaked with blood, eyes wide with fear. Supply run went bad. Truck crashed. We're trapped. Fisher? Second floor, trying to organize a defense. But we're overrun. Too many of them. The generator, I said urgently. Is it still operational? Basement level. East wing, still running. I need to reach it. I might be able to create a diversion, draw them away. Eric shook his head. Can't get there. They'd taken the ground floor, all access points. There has to be another way. Maintenance tunnels, exterior access. There's a service entrance outside, north side. Leads directly to the mechanical room. But it's probably surrounded too. I checked my equipment, scanning the north facade. Few were there. I might be able to reach it. Get back inside. Tell Fisher to prepare for evacuation. Everyone should be ready to move the moment the infected are drawn away. Eric nodded, slipping back inside. I circled the building, moving from cover to cover. The service entrance was partially obscured by dumpsters, with only 3 infected nearby. I could handle 3. I removed a small device from my pack, one of my acoustic lures, modified for short-range distraction. I'd activated it and tossed it toward an alley across the street. The subtle noise it emitted was precisely calibrated to attract infected attention, without being loud enough to draw those farther away. The 3 infected shambled toward the sound. I moved quickly to the service entrance, finding it locked but not barricaded. My knife blade slipped between the door and frame, lifting the latch mechanism. Basic security, not designed to withstand determined entry. The service corridor beyond was dark, lit only by emergency lighting. I followed the sound of the generator, a steady mechanical rhythm distinctive from the chaotic noises of infected throughout the building. The basement level was remarkably clear. The infected seemed drawn to movement and noise above, leaving lower levels less populated. I reached the mechanical room without encountering resistance. The generator was larger than I expected, a commercial model running at reduced capacity to conserve fuel. Perfect for my purposes. It already had external speaker systems connected, part of the building's emergency alert infrastructure. Working quickly, I modified the connections, rerouting power to amplify specific frequencies. My theory was simple but untested. If infected were drawn to certain sound patterns, those same patterns at higher volume would create a more powerful attraction. Like a superior food source, drawing predators away from lesser prey. I programmed a sequence of tones based on my acoustic research, frequencies that had demonstrated the strongest attraction response in infected subjects. Set it on a timer with progressive volume increase. The generator had enough fuel for several hours of operation at full capacity. More than enough for evacuation purposes. When the system was ready, I contacted Fisher via the building's internal communications system. Lieutenant Fisher, this is Whisper. I've rigged the generator to create a massive sound diversion. North side will clear first. Be ready to evacuate in that direction when I give the signal. Her voice came back, tense but controlled. Understood. We got wounded. 15 mobile survivors, 3 requiring assistance. How many lost? A pause. 5 confirmed, maybe more. I swallowed hard. 5 people who had been alive when I left. People I'd spoken with, shared meals with. Stand by. Diversion commencing in 2 minutes. I made final adjustments, ensuring the system would continue functioning without my presence. The timing was crucial. The sound needed to start quietly, gradually increasing to draw infected away without immediately revealing the survivors' evacuation route. As I worked, I became aware of movement in the corridor outside the mechanical room. Shuffling footsteps, the distinctive breathing pattern of infected. At least 2, maybe 3, drawn perhaps by the subtle sounds of my equipment adjustments. They were between me and the exit. No alternative escape route from the mechanical room. If I activated the diversion, I'd be trapped with them, drawn directly to my location. If I didn't, the survivors above would remain trapped. No time for hesitation. I started the sequence, the first subtle tones barely audible to human ears, but within the enhanced sensitivity range of the infected. I positioned myself beside the doorway, knife ready, equipment monitoring the corridor. The infected responded immediately, but not as expected. Instead of being drawn toward the emerging sound source, they became agitated, movement patterns erratic. Something about the confined space was affecting the acoustic properties, creating confusion rather than clear directional attraction. I adjusted the sequence, increasing specific frequencies. The infected movements became more directed, drawing them past the mechanical room door toward the main generator output. As they shuffled past, I slipped into the corridor behind them, moving toward the service entrance. The diversion built in intensity, sound patterns beginning to penetrate throughout the building. Through my headphones, I could detect shifting movement patterns above, infected beginning to descend, drawn to the more powerful auditory stimulus. I reached the service entrance, cracking the door to observe the external situation. The street was clearing, infected moving with singular purpose toward the building's main entrance, converging on what they perceived as the primary sound source. I contacted Fisher again. North side clearing. East service entrance is your best exit point. Move quickly but quietly. The diversion won't last forever. Copy that. Moving now. I held the service door, counting infected as they streamed past, drawn to the main entrance. Over 100 within view, and more arriving from surrounding areas. The diversion was working almost too well, potentially drawing infected from a wider radius than anticipated. Minutes later, the first survivors appeared in the service corridor, Fisher leading, rifle ready, eyes constantly scanning. Behind her came others, carrying packs, supporting wounded companions. Aces strained, determined. The professor, the former park ranger, others I recognized from my brief stay. Eric, I asked as they filed past. Coming with the last group, Fisher replied tersely. We need to move. Where to? Forest Edge, north-northeast. I've scouted it. Lowest infected concentration in that direction. Fisher nodded, leading her people in a tight formation. Disciplined, minimal noise, covering each other's movements. They'd prepared for this evacuation, practiced it perhaps. The wounded were carried efficiently. Those too injured to walk transported on improvised stretchers. I remained at the door, monitoring approaching infected, until the final group appeared. Eric among them, helping an elderly woman who walked with difficulty. Behind them came a young man I didn't recognize, backing up slowly, a baseball bat held defensively. That's everyone, Eric informed me. The others didn't make it. We joined the main group, moving away from the building in a silent procession. Behind us, the sound diversion continued to draw infected from throughout the town, concentrating them around the apartment building we'd abandoned. We reached the forest edge without incident, continuing deeper into cover before Fisher finally called a halt in a small clearing. The group was exhausted, some showing signs of injuries sustained during the initial breach or subsequent defense. What happened? I asked once they'd established a perimeter. Fisher's face was grim. Supply run. We've been doing them successfully for weeks, always following the same protocols. Quiet vehicles, minimal personnel, strict noise discipline. This time something went wrong. Truck engine failed on the return journey. Driver panicked, crashed trying to evade a group of infected. The alarm couldn't be disabled, added the young man with the baseball bat. Electronics fried in the crash. By the time we realized it couldn't be stopped, they were already converging. You saved us, Eric said simply. Again, I shook my head. I just bought time. Your preparation did the rest. Where do we go now? Asked the elderly woman, Professor Kelvin's wife, from what I could gather. The apartment was everything. Our supplies, medicine, shelter. All eyes turned to Fisher, then to me. Two different types of leadership, one forged in military discipline, the other in scientific observation. Neither fully prepared for this situation. We need distance from the town, I said finally. That sound diversion will draw infected for miles around. The concentration will be unprecedented. Once the generator fails, they'll spread out, searching for the sound source. How far is your research station? Fisher asked. 10 miles. Uphill. Defensible, but not designed for this many people. Limited supplies, space. Any better options? I considered, mind racing through possibilities. There's a ranger station about 5 miles east. Smaller than the apartment complex, but isolated, potentially defensible. Might have supplies, equipment. 5 miles, Fisher repeated, looking at her wounded. We can make 5 miles. Not all at once, but in stages. The decision was made. We would move east, toward the ranger station in manageable segments. The wounded would rest while scouts moved ahead to secure the next position. Retreat was no longer an option, only forward movement toward uncertain sanctuary. As we prepared to move, I distributed my remaining acoustic lures among those with the best situational awareness. Basic instruction in their use, how to deploy them as distractions if needed. Knowledge transfer in its most urgent form. Fisher approached as I was explaining the directional sensitivity of the infected to one of her scouts. Your research, she said. Did you recover it? I patted my pack. Everything essential. Data, analyses, observations. Good, because I'm starting to think understanding these things is as important as outrunning them. She glanced at the distant rooftops of Riverside, barely visible through the trees. They're evolving faster than we are. Not exactly evolving, I clarified. Adapting through selection pressure. The behaviors that work are reinforced across the population. Semantics, Fisher replied. The point is they're getting better at hunting us. We need to get better at evading them. She was right, of course. What I'd witnessed in Riverside confirmed my worst fears about infected adaptation. The group movements were more coordinated, their response to stimuli more efficient. The sound diversion had worked, but their initial confusion in the basement suggested they were already developing more sophisticated sound localization capabilities. We began our journey toward the ranger station, moving through forest rather than following roads or trails. The terrain was challenging, especially for the wounded, but provided better concealment and natural sound dampening. I stayed near the front, constantly monitoring with my equipment, diverting our path whenever infected signatures appeared in our vicinity. Fisher maintained group discipline admirably. Despite fear, exhaustion, and recent trauma, her people moved with purpose and minimal noise. When rest was necessary, they established temporary perimeters, quiet watch rotations, no fires, no unnecessary movement or conversation. By late afternoon, we'd covered just over half the distance to the ranger station. The pace was slower than hoped, but we'd encountered only scattered infected, easily avoided. Fisher called a longer rest in a small clearing beside a stream. Water access, good visibility, multiple exit routes. As the group refilled water containers and tended to wounds, I took the opportunity to process what had happened. The apartment group had been well organized, disciplined, with solid security protocols. Yet they'd still been overrun, their sanctuary compromised by a single mistake. No margin for error in this new world. Eric joined me as I adjusted my equipment, scanning our surroundings. You came back, he said simply. You could have stayed safe at your station. Safety is relative, I replied, and temporary. Still, most people would have heard that chaos and gone the other direction. I considered this. Before the outbreak, he might have been right. I chose an isolation for my work, preferred the company of equipment to people. But perspective shifts when the world ends. I need people to survive, I admitted. Not just physically. Knowledge is only valuable if it's shared. Eric nodded. The professor said something similar before we evacuated. That surviving alone isn't really surviving at all. Fisher interrupted our philosophical moment with practical concerns. Daylight's fading. We need to cover more ground before dark. Can your equipment still function effectively at night? Yes, but with limitations. Background noise levels drop after dark, which makes infected vocalizations more distinctive. But visual confirmation becomes impossible, increasing risk. We'll move for another hour, then secure position for the night. No negotiation, she added, looking at some of the more exhausted survivors. We're still too close to the town. We resumed our journey, paced slightly quicker, as the group found its rhythm. The forest grew denser, terrain more challenging, but we maintained formation and direction. My acoustic monitoring detected scattered infected in our vicinity, but none directly in our path. The concentration around Riverside had drawn many away from the surrounding wilderness, creating a temporary safety buffer. As twilight approached, we reached a small elevated clearing with good sightlines. Not ideal for overnight security, but better than continuing in darkness. Fisher organized the group into watch rotations, established a defensive perimeter, and distributed the remaining supplies. I took first watch, adjusting my equipment for night monitoring. The acoustic patterns shifted with nightfall, animal sounds changing, wind patterns altering, temperature affecting sound propagation. I calibrated accordingly, creating a comprehensive acoustic map of our surroundings. As the others settled into uneasy rest, I reflected on the future awaiting us. The ranger station might provide temporary shelter, but what then? Winter approaching, supplies dwindling, infected adapting. And somewhere to the east, the possibility that my sister and her children had reached safety. Our path forward was uncertain, but one thing to become clear: survival would depend on understanding the thing hunting us. My research, once academic, had become the difference between life and death. Not just for me, but for all of us trying to navigate this changed world. Morning came with a dense fog blanketing the forest, limiting visibility but providing additional concealment as we resumed our journey. The group moved more efficiently now, having found a rhythm despite exhaustion and injuries. Fisher led with quiet authority, while I maintained constant acoustic monitoring of our surroundings. We reached the ranger station by mid-morning, approaching cautiously from the cover of surrounding trees. The structure stood intact, a main building with office space and visitor center, several smaller outbuildings for equipment storage and staff quarters. Solar panels on the roof suggested potential power, though whether systems remained functional was uncertain. Fisher deployed scouts to secure the perimeter while I focused on acoustic analysis. The area was remarkably quiet, few infected signatures within detection range. The station's isolation had protected it from the worst of the outbreak, a stroke of luck we desperately needed. The scouts reported no visible infected inside or around the immediate vicinity. Signs of hasty evacuation were evident, personal items left behind, vehicles missing from the parking area. But no bodies, no blood. The staff had gotten out, or at least tried to. We moved the group inside, securing entrances behind us. The interior confirmed our initial assessment, abandoned but not overrun. Fisher immediately organized search teams to inventory supplies, while others established defensive positions and tended to the wounded. The ranger station proved to be a substantial improvement over our forest encampment. Solar power systems were intact, providing limited electricity. Water cisterns on the roof offered clean water. Storage rooms contained emergency supplies, preserved food, medical kits, even extra clothing and blankets. Most valuable were the topographical maps covering the surrounding 50 miles, including marked evacuation routes and emergency rally points. As the group settled in, claiming spaces and establishing a home base of sorts, I set up my equipment in what had been the communications office. The ranger station's radio systems were more powerful than anything I'd worked with previously. If any organized response still existed, this would be our best chance to make contact. Fisher joined me as I was connecting my acoustic monitoring equipment to the station's power system. "What's your assessment?" she asked directly. "Good defensive position," I replied. "Elevated clear sight lines, multiple fallback options. Low infected presence currently, though that could change. Sustainable for at least a few weeks with careful rationing." She nodded. The medical supplies will help stabilize our wounded. Found some antibiotics, proper dressings. Eric says 2 of the critical cases should improve within days. And the long term? I asked, knowing we both were thinking beyond immediate survival. Winter's coming, she said simply. This elevation will see snow within weeks. The building has heating systems, but fuel is limited. Game will become scarcer. We need a more permanent solution. I gestured to the maps spread across the communications desk. These might help. Emergency protocols, evacuation routes, and this, I pointed to a marked location about 40 miles east, Fort Simmons, the destination on my sister's evacuation assignment. Fisher studied the map carefully. Former military installation. Good location strategically, defensible, water access, sufficient distance from major population centers. If any government response consolidated successfully, that's as likely a location as any. It's also where Leah might be, I added, with her kids. Fisher's expression softened slightly. We can't move the whole group immediately, not with our wounded. But a small scouting party could make the journey, assess the situation. I'll go, I said without hesitation. My equipment gives the best chance of avoiding infected concentrations. Not alone, she countered. 2 minimum for security. I'd send more, but we can't spare the personnel. The decision was made. I would depart the following morning with Lynn, the former park ranger whose wilderness skills complemented my acoustic expertise. We would travel light, fast, reaching Fort Simmons within 2 days if conditions permitted. Basic reconnaissance only. Determine if the facility remained operational, if organized survivors had established a foothold, if evacuation buses had successfully arrived. I spent the remainder of the day preparing, transferring my most critical research data to paper in case of equipment failure, studying maps to plan our route, testing the ranger station's radio equipment in hopes of detecting any transmissions from Fort Simmons or other survivor outposts. The radio yielded nothing but static across most frequencies, occasionally fragments of automated emergency broadcasts, repeating endlessly without updates. Once, what sounded like a human voice, too distant and broken by interference to comprehend. The airwaves were as dead as most of the population. That evening, Fisher gathered the group for a meeting in the main visitor center. 18 survivors, reduced from 23 who had escaped the apartment complex. 2 had succumbed to injuries during our forest journey. 3 more were critical, but stabilized under Eric's care. We've secured this location temporarily, Fisher announced. Established basic defenses, confirmed supply inventory. We have food for approximately 3 weeks at current consumption rates. Water is renewable thanks to collection systems in nearby stream. Medical supplies sufficient for current needs. She outlined duties, watch rotations, noise discipline protocols. The same military efficiency that had kept them alive at the apartment complex, adapted to this new location. When practical matters were addressed, she introduced our reconnaissance mission. Whisper and Lynn will depart tomorrow to investigate Fort Simmons as a potential long-term destination. Their assessment will help determine our next steps. Questions followed. Reasonable concerns about splitting our already reduced numbers, about what would constitute a viable sanctuary, about contingency plans if Fort Simmons proved compromised. Fisher addressed each methodically, neither offering false hope nor succumbing to pessimism. As the meeting concluded, Professor Kelvin approached me privately. "Before you leave, I'd like to review your research data," he said. "Your observations about infected adaptation could be crucial to developing more effective countermeasures." I spent an hour with the professor, sharing my acoustic analyses, behavioral observations, and adaptation theories. His academic background was in evolutionary biology, not directly applicable to our situation, but providing theoretical frameworks that helped contextualize my observations. "Remarkable," he said repeatedly as we reviewed spectrographs showing changes in infected vocalizations over time. Not just random variations but consistent shifts toward more efficient communication patterns. It suggests some underlying mechanism for information transfer between individuals. Not conscious communication, I clarified. More like behavioral contagion. Successful patterns being mimicked and spread through the population. Even without conscious intent, the effect remains concerning, he noted. If they continue adapting at this rate, our current avoidance strategies may become ineffective within months. His assessment matched my own fears. The infected were changing faster than we could develop countermeasures. Our advantage, human intelligence, planning, cooperation, was substantial but not unlimited. Their advantage, numbers, lack of self-preservation instinct, Increasingly efficient hunting behaviors grew stronger as traditional human resources dwindled. I slept fitfully that night, mind racing with scenarios, contingencies, possibilities. The mission to Fort Simmons represented more than finding my sister or a secure location. It was about determining if organized human resistance still existed on any meaningful scale. If government or military infrastructure remained functional. If there was any plan beyond day-to-day survival. Dawn came too quickly. Lynn and I prepared in the pre-morning darkness, checking equipment, reviewing routes. We would travel light, essential supplies, weapons, communication equipment. I focused on acoustic monitoring gear, confident in Lynn's wilderness navigation skills. Fisher met us at the eastern exit as first light appeared. 48 hours, she said. If you're not back, we assume compromise and implement contingency planning. Understood, Lynn replied. Radio contact at predetermined intervals if possible. If Fort Simmons is operational, if they have organization, supplies, defenses, make contact, Fisher continued. Evaluate trustworthiness, intentions. We've encountered other survivor groups with different priorities. I understood her meaning. Not all who survived did so through cooperation. Some took what they needed by force. The apartment group had encountered such people before my arrival, a story referenced but never fully shared. We departed as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, moving through forest rather than following roads. Lynn set a brisk pace, her knowledge of terrain allowing for efficient routing through areas I would have found impassable. My equipment remained active, constantly scanning for infected signatures. The terrain changed as we moved east, forest giving way to more open country, rolling hills with scattered tree cover. Less concealment but better visibility and sound propagation. My detection range increased substantially in the open landscape. By midday, we had covered nearly 15 miles, excellent progress, though achieved through relentless pace with minimal breaks. We paused briefly in an abandoned farmhouse, checking maps against landmarks, confirming our route. Another 25 miles to Fort Simmons, Lynn calculated. If we maintained pace, we could reach the perimeter by tomorrow morning. I adjusted my equipment, scanning our surroundings. Infected concentration increasing ahead, I reported. Not directly in our path, but numerous enough to warrant caution. Possibly drawn to the fort itself, if it's generating noise activity. Or drawn to the people trying to reach it, Lynn suggested grimly. Evacuation routes would have been heavily traveled. Might still be. Hunting grounds. The implication chilled me. The infected appeared to remain in areas where they had successfully found prey previously. If the evacuation routes became killing zones during the initial outbreak, those areas might now contain concentrated infected populations, still seeking victims. We altered our route slightly, adding miles but potentially avoiding higher-risk zones. The afternoon brought our first direct encounter, a small group of infected, perhaps 5 or 6, moving through a valley we needed to cross. Rather than backtrack, we utilized one of my acoustic lures, drawing them south while we circled north. The encounter highlighted a continuing evolution in infected behavior. They responded to the lure, but not with the immediate, unquestioning pursuit I'd observed earlier. Their movements showed hesitation, irregular patterns. One remained stationary, moaning at a different frequency than the others. Sentinel behavior or simply malfunction? Impossible to determine without closer study. We made camp as darkness fell, if camp is the right word for hiding in a drainage culvert, taking turns monitoring while the others slept briefly. No fire, minimal movement, constant vigilance. The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant in the absence of human-like pollution. The world had returned to darkness, physically and metaphorically. Lynn took first watch while I closed my eyes, not expecting true sleep. My mind continued processing data, patterns, possibilities. The infected were changing. We were adapting to, but more slowly, constrained by diminishing resources and the fundamental need for rest, food, security. A sustainable adaptation race seemed increasingly improbable. I woke to Lynn's hand on my shoulder, her finger pressed to her lips. She pointed toward the culvert entrance. My equipment, still active beside me, showed multiple acoustic signatures approaching. I checked the display. At least 12 distinct infected, moving in a loose formation that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. We froze, barely breathing, as they passed overhead. Their moaning had a particular cadence I hadn't documented before, rising and falling in an almost rhythmic pattern. Not communication, but something unsettlingly close to it. Once they passed beyond detection range, Lynn whispered, that was different. They moved like they were searching, not wandering. I nodded, rechecking my equipment settings to ensure accurate readings. The vocalizations were synchronized. Harmonic relationship between individuals. What does that mean for us? It means we need to reach Fort Simmons sooner rather than later, I replied. The adaptation curve is steepening. We resumed our journey before dawn, moving with renewed urgency through increasingly open terrain. As morning light spread across the landscape, we caught our first distant glimpse of Fort Simmons, concrete walls and watchtowers visible on a plateau approximately 10 miles away. My equipment detected a dramatic increase in infected concentration as we approached, not surrounding the fort itself, but clustered along the main roads leading to it. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, in loosely defined groupings that shifted and moved like schools of fish. Evacuation bottleneck, Lynn suggested, studying the patterns through binoculars. Everyone trying to reach safety at once. Perfect feeding opportunity for the infected. The fort itself appears secure, I noted, focusing my directional microphone toward the installation. No infected signatures within the perimeter that I can detect. There's power. Electrical systems functioning. Hope rose cautiously. Functioning electricity suggested organization, resources, sustained human presence. The fort's elevated position and military-grade perimeter would provide excellent defense against infected incursion. The challenge would be reaching it. The infected concentration between our position and the fort presented a significant obstacle. Direct approach would be suicide, even with acoustic diversion tactics. Lynn studied the topographical maps, tracing potential routes with her finger. There's a maintenance access here. She indicated a point on the fort's western side. Service road for utilities, water treatment. Less direct than main entrances, potentially less watched by both infected and fort security. We adjusted our route accordingly, circling wide to approach from the west. The detour added miles and hours, but improved survival probability substantially. By late afternoon, we had reached the foothills surrounding the plateau, close enough to observe the fort in detail. Activity was visible on the walls. Human figures moving with purpose, organized patrol patterns. A guard tower on the southwest corner emitted a sweeping light beam despite daylight hours, a signal to potential survivors perhaps. Most promising was an American flag flying from the Central Administration Building. Official presence, chain of command, continuation of government function. We need to approach carefully, Lynn cautioned. If they maintain security this long, they'll be suspicious of newcomers. Potential infection risk. They'll have protocols, I agreed. Quarantine procedures, medical screening. We worked our way closer as dusk approached, using natural features for concealment. The maintenance access route proved lightly guarded by infected, just scattered individuals rather than the concentrated hordes surrounding main entrances. We avoided direct engagement, utilizing terrain and patience to remain undetected. The service road led to a secured gate in the perimeter fence, chain link with barbed wire, separate from the fort's main concrete walls. A small security checkpoint stood empty, but functional lights indicated power. More importantly, the gate showed signs of recent use. Tire tracks, footprints, maintained clearing of vegetation. Now what? Lynn whispered as we observed from cover. Make noise, draw attention. Too risky, I replied. Might attract infected before fort personnel. Let me try something else. I adjusted my equipment, focusing on the fort's internal communication frequencies. Military installations typically maintained radio systems for internal coordination. If Fort Simmons was operational, those systems would be active. After several minutes of scanning, I detected a communication channel with regular transmission patterns. Military brevity codes, position reports, standard security protocols. I recorded a brief message identifying ourselves as survivors seeking refuge, mentioning Lieutenant Fisher specifically as she had military credentials that might facilitate trust. The response came more quickly than expected. A terse acknowledgement, instructions to remain at the service gate, verification that a security team would approach our position within 30 minutes. No guarantees, no welcome, but acknowledgement of our presence. We waited, tense but hopeful, as darkness fell completely. My equipment continued monitoring for infected movement in our vicinity, detecting nothing immediate but concerning concentration shifting patterns approximately 1 mile east. Headlights appeared on the service road inside the perimeter. A military vehicle approaching cautiously. It stopped 50 yards from the gate, lights illuminating the approach area while keeping the vehicle itself in shadow. Tactical positioning, standard security procedure. Identify yourselves, hands visible, came an amplified voice from the vehicle. Lynn and I stepped into the light, hands raised, keeping movements slow and deliberate. Thaddeus Bennett and Lynn Carter, I called back. Survivors from Riverside, seeking information about evacuees and potential refuge. The silence stretched uncomfortably before the vehicle advanced. 4 armed personnel emerged, maintaining defensive positions while their leader approached the gate. "I'm Captain Reynolds, Fort Simmons Security," he introduced himself, studying us carefully through the chain link. "What's your business here specifically?" "Intelligence gathering primarily," I explained. "We represent a survivor group currently sheltered at the ranger station 30 miles west. I'm also seeking information about specific evacuees from Seattle." My sister and her children were assigned to Bus 17, scheduled for evacuation to this facility. Reynolds' expression remained neutral professional. "We'll need to verify you're not infected. Standard protocol requires 48-hour quarantine and medical screening before any access to general population areas." "Understood," Lynn replied. "We anticipated as much." "The equipment," Reynolds indicated my acoustic monitoring gear. "What is it?" "Modified sound engineering tools," I explained. I was a NOAA researcher before the outbreak. The equipment detects infected through their distinctive acoustic signatures, allows for early warning and avoidance. This caught his interest. "You can track them by sound?" "At what range?" "Up to a mile under ideal conditions, less in complex terrain or high ambient noise environments." Reynolds spoke briefly into his radio, then turned back to us. "We're opening the gate. You'll be escorted to quarantine facilities. Equipment will be examined by our technical staff. If cleared medically, we'll discuss your situation further." The gate opened automatically, creating a momentary vulnerability in the perimeter that made me nervous despite the armed guards. We entered quickly, gate securing behind us with reassuring finality. As we boarded their vehicle, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind for weeks. "The evacuation buses from Seattle, did they arrive?" "Specifically Bus 17, Reynolds met my gaze directly. "Some buses made it through. Records office can verify specific arrivals once you clear quarantine. That's the best I can offer right now." It wasn't the certainty I hoped for, but it was something. The fort was operational, organized, secure. Evacuation buses had arrived, at least some of them. The possibility that Leah and her children had reached safety remained alive. As we drove through the perimeter toward the main installation, I observed military discipline in action. Regular patrols, maintained infrastructure, functioning systems. Beyond the security fence, infected wandered in the darkness, drawn to the human activity but unable to breach the defenses. 2 worlds separated by concrete and steel and organization. Inside, humanity continued. Outside, something else evolved. Our brief journey had confirmed both my greatest hope and my deepest fear. Human survival was possible, but the threat was adapting faster than we could respond. The quarantine facility was a repurposed barracks, modified with medical monitoring equipment and enhanced security. As we were processed, basic medical evaluations, documentation of personal information, surrender of weapons for the quarantine period. I caught glimpses of the wider fort operations through windows and open doorways. Hundreds of survivors, military and civilian, moving with purpose. Gardens established in open areas, suggesting food production efforts. Solar arrays expanding beyond original military installation designs. A community forming from the ashes of collapse. They separated Lynn and me for individual processing. As a medical officer drew blood samples and checked vital signs, I asked about the fort's broader situation. "How many survivors here total?" The officer, focused on her work, answered with clinical detachment. "Approximately 800 current residents. Combination of military personnel, government continuity staff, and civilian evacuees. Another 200 in satellite facilities within secured perimeter. Organization, leadership. Military command structure integrated with civilian expertise. Essential services prioritized, security, medicine, food production, engineering. Everyone contributes according to skills and capacity." As she worked, I caught sight of something that made my heart skip. A bulletin board visible through a partially open door. Photographs, hundreds of them, with names and information. A missing persons board, people searching for family and friends. The medical officer noticed my focus. "Family reunification efforts," she explained. "Limited communications between safe zones necessitates physical documentation. Once you clear quarantine, you can check records for your sister." For the first time in weeks, I felt something beyond mere determination to survive. Hope, fragile but persistent. Not just for Leah and her children, but for humanity as a whole. The fort represented more than safety. It was the seed of rebuilding, of adaptation, not just to survive, but to reclaim what we'd lost. As I settled into quarantine isolation, my equipment temporarily confiscated for security evaluation, I thought about Fisher's group at the ranger station, about Eric treating the wounded with limited supplies, about Professor Kelvin studying my infected behavior data, seeking patterns, weaknesses, solutions. If Fort Simmons remained secure, if they accepted our group, if Leah had indeed arrived safely, many if still, but each more plausible than they had seemed days earlier. Perhaps survival wasn't merely possible but sustainable. Yet as I drifted toward exhausted sleep, my mind returned to the infected we'd observed on our journey. Their evolving behaviors, coordinated movements, synchronized vocalizations. The adaptation curve accelerating. The ranger station group needed to reach Fort Simmons quickly, before winter, before the infected developed new hunting strategies. Tomorrow I would learn if Leah had survived. Then, regardless of that answer, Lynn and I would return to the ranger station with crucial intelligence. The journey back would be dangerous but necessary. 1 month into the apocalypse, individual survival was no longer enough. Only by sharing knowledge, combining resources, and understanding the threat could humanity hope to reclaim its world. The infected were learning to hunt more effectively. We needed to learn faster. The quarantine period passed with agonizing slowness. 48 hours of medical monitoring, blood tests, neurological examinations. Standard procedure, they assured me, necessary to protect the fort population. I understood the logic, but each hour delayed was another hour of uncertainty about Leah and her children. I used the time to document my observations from our journey. The modified infected behaviors, synchronization patterns, evolving acoustic signatures. The medical staff showed interest in my notes, particularly a doctor specializing in infectious disease control. She asked detailed questions about progression timelines, behavioral changes, potential weaknesses I'd observed. Your data aligns with our field reports, she told me during a follow-up examination. Increased coordination between infected individuals, more efficient hunting behaviors. Your acoustic analysis adds a dimension we hadn't fully documented. How widespread is the outbreak? I asked, seizing the opportunity for information. Beyond the Pacific Northwest, she hesitated, clearly weighing operational security against the value of shared knowledge. Continental, she finally replied, possibly global, though communication with overseas facilities remains sporadic. Population centers hit hardest, as you'd expect. Rural areas variable depending on evacuation patterns, population density, terrain. Organized response. Fragmented. Military continuity protocols activated, government emergency structures maintaining limited function. Approximately 30 secure zones established nationwide, varying sizes and sustainability profiles. Fort Simmons is designated Northwest Regional Command, coordinating surviving military and civilian assets from Washington to Montana. More organization than I'd dared hope for, though still catastrophic compared to pre-outbreak governance. But human adaptability was proving resilient, even against unprecedented collapse. When quarantine finally ended, a staff member escorted me to records and family reunification. The facility occupied what had been the fort's administrative building, transformed into an information processing center with remarkable efficiency. Paper files, computer stations with limited power allocation, handwritten records where digital systems had failed. The records officer, a civilian woman with the focus and efficiency of a career bureaucrat, took my information dispassionately. Bennett Leah. Harbor Medical Center employee. 2 children. Bus 17 evacuation assignment. October 14th departure from Seattle. She disappeared into rows of filing cabinets, returning minutes later with a folder. My heart pounded as she reviewed its contents. Bus 17 arrived at Fort Simmons perimeter checkpoint on October 15th, 27 surviving passengers of original 42. Leah Bennett and 2 minors, Sophia and Marcus, processed and admitted to civilian housing section C. My legs nearly buckled with relief. They're here? They're alive? According to intake records, yes. Current status. She checked a separate logging system, still resident, section C7. Medical status clear, assigned to hospital support staff based on prior experience. They were alive, here, within these walls. The narrow thread of hope I'd clung to for weeks suddenly solidified into certainty. Family reunification protocols required verification of my identity, processing of paperwork, coordination with section administrators. Bureaucracy continuing even after apocalypse. I hardly registered the procedures, my mind fixed on a single thought. Leah, Sophia, Marcus. Alive. Safe. Here. When the records officer finally said, "You can see them now," I nearly ran from the building, following the escort through the fort's organized grid of structures, past gardens and water collection systems, solar arrays and training facilities. A community rebuilding amid collapse. Section C7 was a repurposed officers' housing block, subdivided to accommodate multiple families. My escort knocked on a door midway down the corridor, stepping back to allow for privacy. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. Leah stood there, changed but unmistakable. Thinner, hair cut short, eyes containing knowledge no one should have to carry. She froze, staring at me with disbelief that transformed into recognition. Then, overwhelming emotion. "Thad," she whispered, as if saying my name might make me disappear. "You're alive." We embraced with the desperate intensity of people who had individually accepted the other's death, only to discover miraculous reprieve. Words failed, unnecessary and insufficient. Behind her, two small figures appeared, Sophia at 9 and Marcus 7. They didn't recognize me at first, then tentatively joined our embrace when Leah explained through tears who I was. The next hours passed in a blur of stories exchanged, experiences shared, grief acknowledged. Leah had been working her shift at Harbor Medical when the first infected arrived. The hospital descended into chaos within hours. Military evacuation teams extracted essential medical personnel and their families, but the journey to Fort Simmons had been harrowing. The bus ahead of theirs was overrun at a roadblock. They witnessed countless horrors through the windows as their driver navigated an increasingly hostile landscape. "We thought you were gone," Leah said, her hand gripping mine as if I might still vanish. "Your station was so isolated. When communications failed, when Seattle fell, we thought no one in the mountains could have survived. The isolation saved me," I explained, "and my equipment. I could hear them coming, track their movements, stay ahead of the danger." I told her about my month of observation, the acoustic research, finding Eric, connecting with Fisher's group, the journey to Fort Simmons. I omitted the worst details, aware of the children listening with the hypervigilance of young survivors. "Your work might help protect this place," Leah said when I explained my acoustic tracking systems. "They're constantly improving security, looking for early warning advantages." She was right. The following morning, Captain Reynolds requested my presence at a security briefing. Lynn was already there, along with senior military officers and technical specialists. They had reviewed my equipment and data thoroughly during quarantine. "Mr. Bennett," the commanding officer began, a colonel whose name tag read Westmoreland, "your acoustic analysis capabilities represent a significant tactical advantage we've been lacking. Our current perimeter monitoring relies primarily on visual confirmation and basic motion detection. Your system could provide earlier warning, enhance night operations, improve resource allocation." "I'm willing to help however I can," I replied, "though my equipment has limitations, and I've observed infected adapting to countermeasures over time." "That's precisely what we need to understand better," the colonel continued. "Not just detection, but prediction. Evolution of threat capabilities, behavioral adaptations, potential weaknesses. Your research combined with our field observations could provide a more comprehensive threat assessment." The meeting continued for hours, my data scrutinized, methodologies questioned, findings debated. Military minds focused on tactical applications, how to detect infected sooner, how to divert them from critical operations, how to neutralize them more efficiently. Scientific staff concentrated on understanding the mechanisms behind observed behaviors. What drove adaptation, how information transferred between infected individuals, whether deterioration or learning would ultimately prevail. I raised the critical question midway through the briefing. Lieutenant Fisher's group at the ranger station, 18 survivors including wounded. They need evacuation before winter. The infected concentration between their position and Fort Simmons is substantial, but with proper planning, extraction should be possible. Colonel Westmoreland exchanged glances with his staff. Resources for external operations are extremely limited. Every vehicle, every gallon of fuel, every armed personnel assigned outside the perimeter represents risk and consumption of irreplaceable assets. "These are skilled survivors," Lynn interjected. "A doctor, a professor specializing in evolutionary biology, military leadership, technical expertise. Assets worth the extraction cost." The debate continued, logistics weighed against humanitarian concerns, potential benefits against undeniable risks. Eventually, a compromise emerged. A small extraction team would deploy, utilizing my acoustic guidance to navigate around the heaviest infected concentrations. Limited resources, narrow window of opportunity, High risk tolerance required. I volunteered immediately. My equipment provides the best chance of successful navigation. I know the terrain, the group, their capabilities. Lynn joined as well, her wilderness expertise invaluable for the return journey. Captain Reynolds would lead the military component. 3 vehicles, 6 personnel, minimal supplies to maximize transport capacity for Fisher's group. Departure scheduled for dawn, 48 hours to complete the mission. The preparation was methodical, almost clinical. Equipment checks, route planning, contingency scenarios. I modified my acoustic monitoring system with components from the fort's technical stores, expanding range and sensitivity. Lynn worked with the transportation team, calculating fuel requirements, identifying alternative routes, marking potential safe harbors if emergency shelter became necessary. The evening before departure, I spent precious hours with Leah and the children. The fort's structural stability, organized defense, and established protocols had begun healing their traumatic journey. The children attended makeshift school, played with other survivors, experienced moments of normalcy amid catastrophe. Leah's medical training made her essential to fort operations, providing purpose beyond mere survival. "You'll come back," Leah said as we sat together after the children slept. Not a question, but an instruction. A demand from someone who had already lost too much. Every reason to, I promised. This place is what we've been searching for: security, organization, future planning. The Ranger Station group deserves the same chance. "Your sound research," she said after a pause. "The military thinks it's significant. Tactical advantage, they keep saying. But it's more than that, isn't it? I consider the question, its implications. It's about understanding what we're facing. Not just avoiding immediate threats, but comprehending the nature of the challenge. The infected are adapting. We need to adapt faster, more intelligently. You think we can win? Actually reclaim what was lost?" "Not reclaim exactly," I clarified. "Build something new that incorporates what we've learned. The old world had weaknesses we never addressed. The new one will be different, hopefully stronger in the ways that matter." We departed at dawn, 3 vehicles moving in tight formation. My acoustic equipment mounted in the lead vehicle, constantly scanning surroundings, identifying threat concentrations, calculating optimal routing. Captain Reynolds drove, accepting my directional guidance without question despite his clear discomfort with civilian input on military operations. The journey began smoothly, following secondary roads where infected presence registered minimal. The vehicles maintained moderate speed, balancing the need for haste against the risk of mechanical noise attracting unwanted attention. Fuel efficiency calculations have provided our operational range, sufficient for the round trip with standard safety margin, but no room for significant detours. Approximately 15 miles from Fort Simmons, we encountered our first major obstacle: a concentrated infected presence blocking our planned route, too numerous to engage directly, too dispersed to bypass easily. The acoustic signature was distinctive: hundreds of individuals moving with unsettling coordination. They're organized differently than previous observations, I noted, studying the patterns on my equipment. More centralized movement, radiating from focal points rather than random distribution. "Meaning what exactly?" Reynolds asked, slowing the vehicle to maintain distance from the threat. "They're establishing territories, optimizing hunting efficiency. This group controls the main transit corridor, probably because it yielded successful hunting during evacuation attempts." "Can we go around?" Lynn asked from the rear seat, studying topographical maps. I adjusted the equipment, scanning alternative routes. Northern detour adds approximately 7 miles, terrain challenging but passable for our vehicles. Infected presence minimal based on acoustic signature. Reynolds radioed the information to following vehicles, implementing the route change with minimal discussion. Military efficiency, adapting to evolving circumstances without dwelling on implications. Yet I could see concern in his expression as he processed the information about infected territorial behavior. The detour proved arduous, unpaved roads deteriorating into little more than forest tracks in places. Vehicles struggled with inclines, mud obstacles. Progress slowed dramatically, burning precious fuel in daylight. But infected encounters remained minimal, validating the acoustic guidance despite operational challenges. By late afternoon, we approached the ranger station from the northeast, deliberately avoiding our original route to minimize predictability. My equipment detected human activity within the station perimeter, movement patterns distinctly different from infected signatures. Fisher's group had maintained their position, continued functioning despite our extended absence. Reynolds established radio contact using predetermined frequencies. Lieutenant Fisher, this is Captain Reynolds. Fort Simmons Security, approaching from northeast with extraction team. Please acknowledge. The response came immediately, Fisher's voice controlled but relief evident. Acknowledged, Captain. Perimeter secure. 18 survivors ready for evacuation. Approach clear from your current vector. We reached the ranger station as evening approached, vehicles positioning for optimal departure configuration. Fisher greeted us with characteristic efficiency, having organized her people and essential supplies for immediate loading. Wounded had stabilized under Eric's care, though 2 required continuing medical support during transport. The reunion with the ranger station group was brief, focused on operational necessities rather than emotional reconnection. Professor Kelvin approached while vehicles were being loaded, clutching research notes we had developed together. Your acoustic data proved invaluable, he said without preamble. Combined with my evolutionary models, it suggests predictable adaptation pathways for the infected. Not just reactive but anticipatory countermeasures might be possible. You'll have better resources at Fort Simmons, I assured him. Research staff, laboratories, computing power. If we reach it, he replied pragmatically. Your absence witnessed substantial behavioral evolution among local infected populations. Increased coordination, territorial establishment, rudimentary ambush capabilities. His assessment aligned with my observations during our extraction journey. The infected were developing more sophisticated hunting strategies, optimizing resource investment, displaying emergent collective behaviors without central coordination. Natural selection in accelerated time frame, terrifying in its efficiency. Loading completed with remarkable speed, Fisher's military background evident in the organized departure preparations. 18 survivors distributed across 3 vehicles, essential supplies secured, wounded stabilized for transport. As darkness fell, we prepared for the most dangerous phase, night movement through increasingly hostile territory. Light acoustic equipment would prove most valuable now, detecting infected movement patterns that visual observation couldn't identify in darkness. Reynolds adjusted operational plans accordingly, positioning my vehicle in lead position despite standard military protocol preferring command vehicle placement. We departed in tight formation, headlights minimized, speed carefully modulated to balance progress against noise generation. The initial 5 miles proceeded without incident, my equipment detecting scattered infected but no concentrated presence threatening our route. Then the acoustic signatures changed dramatically. Ahead, patterns emerged indicating unusual movement. Not the random wandering of individual infected, nor the loosely coordinated grouping we'd observed previously. This was different, directional, purposeful, moving to intercept our route. Something's wrong, I warned Reynolds. They're converging ahead. Multiple groups, coordinated movement patterns, almost like they're anticipating our route. That's not possible, he replied, but slowed the vehicle nonetheless. They don't plan, don't think. They don't need to think to adapt, I countered. They're responding to successful hunting patterns. This road has seen vehicle movement before. They're learning. Reynolds considered this tactical assessment overriding skepticism. Alternative route? I scanned surrounding options, acoustic signatures painting a grim picture. Convergence patterns on all primary approaches. They've established ambush points on obvious travel corridors. Suggestions? His question acknowledged the value of specialized knowledge over rank in this situation. I studied the acoustic mapping, identifying patterns, weaknesses. They're concentrated at choke points, intersections, bridges, narrow passages. Terrain features that funnel movement. We need to avoid predictable routing entirely. Lynn leaned forward from the back seat, topographical map illuminated by dim red light. Cross-country possible here. She indicated a section approximately 2 miles ahead. Meadow terrain, gentle grade, vehicles can handle it if conditions are dry. Reynolds radioed the plan to following vehicles, adjusting course toward the identified departure point. The meadow, when we reached it, appeared viable, open ground with sufficient visibility, even in limited light, firm soil capable of supporting vehicle weight. We left the road in tight formation, maintaining visual contact between vehicles. The meadow crossing proceeded more smoothly than anticipated, infected presence minimal in the open terrain. They had indeed concentrated along established travel routes, leaving alternate paths relatively clear. 5 miles further, however, the tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. My equipment detected massive infected convergence ahead, hundreds, perhaps thousands, moving with unmistakable purpose toward our position. They detected us, I informed Reynolds. Not just our current position, but projecting our route. They're moving to intercept further ahead. That's impossible, he repeated, but with less conviction. They don't have that capability. They're not calculating, I clarified. They're responding to stimuli, patterns they've experienced before. Vehicles move predictably through terrain. They've encountered enough vehicle movements to recognize patterns. Reynolds processed this, military assessment weighing options. Distance to Fort Simmons, approximately 12 miles on optimal route. But infected concentration between our position and the fort is unprecedented. Direct approach, suicide with current resources. Alternatives, I adjusted equipment, scanning surrounding territory for acoustic dead zones, areas with minimal infected presence. Northwestern approach shows reduced activity. Adds distance, but improves survival probability. The decision required no debate. Survival superseded efficiency. Reynolds implemented course change, vehicles adjusting formation to navigate increasingly challenging terrain. Fuel concerns mounted with each additional mile, each difficult ascent, each obstacle requiring multiple attempts. The Northwestern approach proved viable initially, infected presence substantially reduced compared to primary routes. But as we moved closer to Fort Simmons, acoustic signatures became increasingly concerning. Not just greater numbers, but changing behavior patterns. Vocalizations synchronized across multiple groups, movement coordinated without apparent central direction. They're communicating, Professor Kelvin observed from the rear seat, having joined my vehicle after equipment redistribution. Not consciously, but functionally. Information transfer through acoustic signaling. Can they track us specifically? Reynolds asked, the tactical implications obvious. Not with purpose, I clarified. But they respond to patterns. Vehicle noise, movement trajectories, environmental disturbance. We're creating a signature they've encountered before. The final approach to Fort Simmons represented the greatest challenge. Infected concentration increased exponentially as we neared the perimeter, drawn by the human activity within, the regular patterns of patrol and maintenance, the fundamental signals of life they hunted. My equipment detected a potential corridor, not absence of infected, but reduced density, disorganized distribution, rather than coordinated grouping. A weakness in their emerging pattern, perhaps random, perhaps significant. There, I directed Reynolds, 3 miles northwest of main entrance. Perimeter fence rather than concrete wall, but inside security zone. Infected presence minimal for approximately half-mile width. Reynolds contacted Fort Simmons Command, requesting emergency perimeter access at the identified coordinates. Authorization came quickly, security teams dispatched to facilitate entry. Our vehicle formation accelerated toward the designated point, pushing mechanical limits, accepting increased noise generation as necessary risk given proximity to safety. The final mile witnessed infected convergence accelerating, drawn by our abandoned stealth, our commitment to speed over silence. They emerged from structures, vegetation, abandoned vehicles, moving with singular purpose toward our position. Fort Simmons' perimeter came into view, chain-linked topped with razor wire, concrete barriers, guard positions. The weak point we'd identified showed minimal defensive reinforcement, but security teams had arrived, creating hasty fortification, establishing fields of fire. Approaching final security zone, Reynolds announced to following vehicles. Maintain formation, maximum speed. Security teams will provide cover and fire. Do not stop until inside perimeter regardless of circumstances. We hit the access point at dangerous velocity, temporary gates swinging open seconds before impact. Security teams engaged with approaching infected. The vehicles passed through in tight succession, gates closing behind the final transport, defensive positions collapsing inward to secure the breached perimeter. Inside, organized chaos as medical teams approached vehicles. Security personnel established containment protocol. Command structure processed the unexpected arrival method. Fisher integrated immediately with military leadership, providing situation report, personnel assessment, resource inventory. I remained with my equipment, monitoring the perimeter, tracking infected response to our arrival. Their behavior continued evolving in real time, testing fence sections, concentrating pressure at perceived weak points, vocalizations coordinating group movements without apparent intent. They're learning from failure, I observed to Professor Kelvin, who had joined my monitoring position. Each unsuccessful approach informing subsequent attempts. Not learning as we understand it, he clarified. Selection pressure. Successful behaviors reinforced across population through observable outcomes. no consciousness, required just iterative adaptation. The result is functionally equivalent, I countered. They're becoming more efficient hunters, more coordinated, more dangerous. He nodded, scientific detachment, momentarily overwhelmed by the implications. And we must become more efficient survivors. Not just reactive, but anticipatory. Understanding their evolution to direct our own. In the days that followed, Fisher's group integrated into Fort Simmons operations. Medical staff treated wounded, technical specialists joined relevant divisions. Professor Kelvin established research collaboration with existing scientific personnel. The fort's organization absorbed new members with remarkable efficiency, assigning roles based on skills and needs. Leah and her children embraced our reunion fully, living quarters rearranged to accommodate family unification. Sophia and Marcus adapted to my presence with the resilience of youth, incorporating another adult guardian into their reconstructed worldview. Military command incorporated my acoustic research into defense protocols, establishing monitoring stations at strategic perimeter positions. Early warning systems expanded, response protocols refined. Professor Kelvin's evolutionary models provided predictive frameworks for infected adaptation, allowing proactive rather than reactive countermeasure development. 1 month after the world ended, I found myself in an unexpected position, not just surviving, but contributing to collective survival. My specialized knowledge, once valuable primarily for environmental research, had become essential to humanity's continued existence. The infected continued evolving outside our walls, behaviors optimizing, coordination increasing, hunting efficiency improving through relentless selection pressure. But inside, humanity adapted too. Not through biological imperatives, but through knowledge, cooperation, purposeful development. We studied their evolution to direct our own. We listened to understand. We learned to anticipate rather than merely react. And in doing so, we maintained the fundamental advantage that separated us from the thing hunting us. The ability to shape our future rather than merely respond to our present. The world had ended, but something new was beginning. And in that fragile, emerging reality, the skills that seemed least practical in the old world, the ability to listen, to truly hear what others couldn't, had become the difference between extinction and continuation. I don't know what comes next. Winter approaches. Resources remain limited. The infected continue adapting outside our walls. But for the first time since that Tuesday in October, when the emergency broadcast interrupted my research, I believe humanity will endure, not unchanged, not unscathed, but persistent, adaptable, capable of hearing the danger and responding before it's too late. That's why I'm recording this, so others will know what we faced, how we survived, what we learned. The infected hunt through sound. We survive by listening better, understanding deeper, adapting more intelligently. Whatever form of human civilization emerges from this collapse, it must retain this knowledge. Listen carefully. They're changing out there. But so are we. And as long as we can hear them coming, we have a chance.